Hello, my name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a very exciting video because today's video is going to be the most surprising books that I read in the year of 2023. I love to do these videos at the end of the year where it's kind of like a little series. I do my most surprising, my most disappointing, my best, and my worst. And so the most surprising list is not necessarily like my best books of the year, but these were the books that surprised me the most. You know, like whether that means these were books that I was going into with some really low expectations for whatever reason. These were books that I was picking up that was like, they might have been outside of my comfort zone. They might have been books that I would have never picked up on my own. Like maybe I was reading them for an experiment and I didn't really think I would like them and then I ended up really enjoying them. Or it might have been because I've read from that author before and I wasn't a big fan of one of their other books and so I wasn't thinking I would like this one. There's a number of different reasons why I would go into a book and find it surprising that I end up really enjoying it. And so we're going to be going through this list together. I have about 12 to 13 books on this list, I think, and some of these do cross over with like my best books of the year, but most of them don't. I think most of these are just books that I was really surprised that I ended up enjoying them. Alright, so the first book kicking off this list is going to be Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. And this is a book that surprised the hell out of me because this is something that is a little bit outside of my comfort zone and not my typical read, because this one is a kind of like historical fiction that almost reads more like literary fiction to me, that's following this character named Elizabeth Zott and she's a scientist. This book takes place in the 50s and the 60s and it's basically following Elizabeth's journey as she's trying to navigate working in science as a woman. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I do tend to love stories like this where we kind of span a character's entire life or we get to follow them for so many years that we really feel like we get to know them. And I also think in a lot of ways, to me, Elizabeth Zott has become one of those like iconic characters that I just feel like I really relate to and connect with. She gives me major like Jo March energy or like Evelyn Hugo, you know, where she's like an iconic woman of her time who's like making a difference in the world in terms of like feminism and like getting more female representation in jobs like this. I guess I just wasn't expecting to absolutely love this and give this 5 stars the way that I did. Like this was my first 5-star read of the year when I read it back in January and it's just been on my mind all year. I actually just finished watching the Apple TV adaptation that just came out of this book and the adaptation was also so good. Second book for me on this list is going to be The Kind Worth Saving by Peter Swanson. And this is one that I was shocked that I loved, okay, because you might be like, wait, what the heck? Because The Kind Worth Killing, you know, the first book in this series is one of my favorite thrillers of all time. And so you might be like, why wouldn't you expect to like the sequel? But, you know, if you know my history with Peter Swanson, he has been a very hit or miss for me author, especially in these last few years. Like, I considered myself to be one of the top Peter Swanson fangirlies, you know, just a few years ago, but ever since, you know, these last couple of years, I feel like he's been putting out some major flops for me personally. 8 Perfect Murders and 9 Lives are like the two that come to mind right away. Like, I really did not like those books at all. And so I was a little bit nervous, you know, going into another Peter Swanson book, especially because this is the sequel to one of my favorite thrillers of all time, The Kind Worth Killing. And I'm so happy to say that I actually enjoyed this sequel probably just as much as I liked The Kind Worth Killing, which is crazy. It's like Peter Swanson is back on his thriller game, baby! And I could not be more excited about that because I was a huge Peter Swanson stan before, so it makes me so happy that this book lived up to all of the hype in my head. If you were wondering, I would recommend reading The Kind Worth Killing before you read The Kind Worth Saving because there are some things in The Kind Worth Saving that it might not hit you as hard if you don't understand the references from the first book. But I think, wow, like it's not very oftentimes that I even read like sequels to thrillers because most of the time I just don't care and I'm not a big series reader anyways, but this one was so good. It was so good. The third most surprising book that I read this year was definitely What Lies in the Woods by Kate Alice Marshall, which I'm so excited that this was actually, it was a book troop pick earlier this year for my book club and it was the first ever 5-star book that I had for my own book club. Isn't that wild? I feel like with my own book club now, I'm like going into everything with like the lowest of expectations because I feel like a lot of the books like that I tend to pick for my book club, like they tend to be flops and that makes me so sad. But I'm so glad that we finally had a winner. Like at least for me, this was a 5-star thriller for me. I had so much fun with this book and I wasn't thinking it was gonna be a 5-star when I started it, but it was just so entertaining and so much fun to read that I couldn't not give this book 5 stars. This is a thriller too that has a really interesting premise and I guess it's actually inspired by a real life case, which I did not know at the time that I was reading this book. And so in this story, it's really fun because we're following these 3 women who were friends a long time ago, 20 years ago when they were like young children. They were wandering the woods together when the protagonist, Naomi, she was attacked by this man and stabbed 17 15 times. And somehow she survived and lived to tell the story, and they were able to put away this man who was a serial killer that was going around killing all these different women. And now this story is taking place like 20 years later, when the friend Olivia is like, I need to tell the full truth, like the full story. And you're kind of like, wait, what? Like maybe they put the wrong man behind bars. Like it says they were heroes, but they were liars. Oh my gosh, this story was just so dramatic. It was so over the top, but it was so much fun. Like this is everything that I'm looking for in a thriller. I had a great time. Another book that was from my book club that was actually a huge success for me this year was The Last Word by Taylor Adams. And this one did surprise me, you know, because I know you might be like, well, what do you mean? Like you enjoyed No Exit, and like that's true. I really enjoyed No Exit from Taylor Adams, but then his last book, Hairpin Bridge, was such a flop that I was like, yeah, I don't know about this. Like I don't know if Taylor Adams still has that magic in him. But then with this book, I mean, I was so surprised how much I love this book. Like I had a freaking great time with it. I think I definitely liked this one as much as I like No Exit, if not maybe even more. And I love that in this story, you know, we're following this book reviewer who like, she gave this book 1 star, and then the author starts to like torment her in real life, and like her life starts to get put, like she's in danger because this guy is so unhinged. This book just felt so like unhinged, but also kind of like realistic in a lot of ways. I mean, if you've been paying attention to some of the stuff happening in the book community this year with authors being very unhinged about 1-star reviews, if you know, you know, then like what the fuck? This was just such an entertaining read. I don't know, I had a great time with it. This is the kind of book that it all takes place on one night. It's just so fast paced. Like there's so many things happening. The action is so intense, and I loved it. I loved it so much. Like I do think the story went on a little bit long, and I think that's the only reason why it didn't end up being like 5 stars for me. I think I gave this like 4 or 4.5. But at the end of the day, like I still had so much fun with this book, and it was definitely a huge surprise that I ended up loving this as much as I did. And then speaking of The Last Word, we also have The Last One by Will Dean. This was a thriller that I read this year that I went in with such low expectations, not only because I had read Will Dean's previous book, Firstborn, and I was not a big fan of that, but I was also kind of like with this book, I was hesitating because I was like, ugh, like it's a thriller and it's so long. I was like, why is this book over 400 pages? Like, and at the time that I read this, I was reading an ARC copy, so like I didn't have access to the audiobook, so I'm like, whatever, like I'm just gonna read this with my eyeballs, and I flew through this book in like 2 sittings because I could not put it down. It was literally so engaging. And what I especially love about this book, and what I think is surprising about this book, is that the premise gives you nothing. Like you don't know anything about what this book is about. Everything that is given to you in the premise or the synopsis happens in the first like 12 pages, and then the story gets absolutely unhinged and chaotic, and I never saw any of it coming. And that's why I think if you're interested in reading this one, I would just say read it and don't read any reviews for it, because I don't know how vague people are being with their reviews. Like I don't know if people are spoiling it, because it is hard to talk about this book without getting into spoilers, because everything that happens on the synopsis happens within the first 10 pages, so you're like, how do I even talk about this book? But all you need to know from the premise, like the synopsis of what it tells you, is that you're following this woman who boards this ship with her partner or her husband, I can't remember, but she gets on the ship with him, and then the next day when she wakes up, her husband's missing, and then she goes out onto the boat and she realizes everyone's gone and she's the only one on this boat, like in this ship in the middle of the ocean. Like she's on a huge headlining cruise ship thing and she's alone. It's so creepy and so terrifying. This is definitely like my favorite thriller that I've ever read that takes place on like a boat or like a ship. I just thought it was so freaking entertaining, and I wasn't expecting to love this one the way that I did. Another book that I read and just absolutely loved was Night's Edge. This is another horror book that I knew very little about, and I had barely heard anybody even talking about this one. And I heard that it was like a vampire type of book, and then I was like, well, I don't know if vampires are really my thing or not. I have quickly discovered this year that I actually really do like reading about vampire in horror books. Like it's just so interesting. And the thing that I think makes this book especially interesting is because the protagonist, like the girl that we're following, she's not even the one who's a vampire. It's actually her mom who's the vampire, and we follow her when she's like a younger girl, when I think she's like 11 or 12 in one of the perspectives, and then we also follow her years later when she's about like 23, and we go back and forth between her perspective in those years. But it's really interesting because this world that these characters live in, like they acknowledge the fact that vampires exist, but they're like technically like not allowed to exist in like regular society. Like they have to put regulations on the vampires. It's just really interesting. It's really fascinating. This book is also sapphic. Like there's a really cute girl-girl romance that's happening between our protagonist and this other girl, Jade. Oh my gosh, I was like here for the romance. It was so cute. I actually just really liked the characters in this book. Like I really connected to both our protagonist and her mother and their kind of like weird dependent like mother-daughter relationship that they had. I just thought it was so interesting. This is definitely like more of a slow burn if you're curious. It's much more of a, like a character study of this like mother-daughter relationship. But the book also becomes absolutely unhinged just at the very end, but it takes a long time to get there. So if you read this book and you thought it was slow, like it's definitely slow, but I just got so sucked into the characters in this world. I just got so invested in it that it flew by for me personally, and I had no idea that this is actually the first book in a series. You bet your ass I'm gonna be reading that second book so fast, like as soon as it comes out next year. Another thriller that I read this year that I ended up really loving was How I'll Kill You, and this one was a bit of a surprise as well. I actually read this book because I read it for a video where I was reading your thriller recommendations, so thank you for the rec. You guys have taste. And the reason why I was surprised I ended up loving this one as much as I did is because this thriller has like a really heavy romance kind of like subplot happening in it, and usually like these days, typically when a thriller or a horror book has some romantic subplot happening, I tend to get so freaking bored because I feel like a lot of times these thriller and horror writers don't know how to write a compelling romance. But in this book, like this was the exception to the rule for me. Like I loved the romance that was happening in this book. Like I loved it. In this story, it's just so fun because you're following these three girls who are all like sisters, and they just make this pact that like they're gonna make these boys fall in love with them and then kill them. And it's about how the youngest, we're following the girl who's the youngest of the three, and now it's like her turn. It's like her rite of passage to like make this boy fall in love with her, and then she has to kill him. But it's like, oh my gosh, because it's stressful because you end up really liking this boy, and like the romance they have is fucking cute, and you end up like shipping it, and then you're like, oh my god, she has to kill him. It's just so dramatic. It's very over the top. I just loved it so much. Like I don't know why, I just connected with the characters. I had a lot of fun with the romance, and this setup is something that I really enjoy reading. One romance book that I read this year that I absolutely loved, that I didn't think that I would enjoy as much as I did, is Something Wild and Wonderful by Anita Kelly. And the only reason why I say I wasn't sure going in is because I have read a book from this author before, and I thought it was just okay. It was like about a 3-star for me. This one in particular, I had a feeling I might enjoy this one more because this follows these two men who are gonna be hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, which if you didn't know, last year I went through a whole obsession with the book Wild, and Wild is a nonfiction book about this woman who hikes the Pacific Crest Trail. And the Pacific Crest Trail is a trail that goes from Washington all the way down through Oregon and California. It's like one of the longest hiking trails in the country or whatever. And I have absolutely no interest in hiking, if you were wondering. I don't know why, I'm just really fascinated by the idea of this Pacific Crest Trail. And so this book is about these two men who meet when they're hiking on the Pacific Crest Trail, and then it's just about how they like develop this connection and like fall in love, and it's literally so cute. And I guess part of me was just convinced that I wouldn't like this book because I didn't really care for the other book that I read from this author, and because if a book is primarily about like hiking, I was like, is that really my thing? Like, I don't know. But turns out I love reading about hiking. Like, I don't think I like actually hiking myself. Like, it always makes me exhausted, and I just like, I'd rather just take the drive up to like whatever the view is, you know? Like, I don't want to hike. But for some reason, reading about hiking, it's just so much fun. And these two, like the romance, like their banter, oh my gosh, like their chemistry was just so much fun to read about. It's also very like Brokeback Mountain at times because of like the whole tent sharing, like, oh my god. Another surprising book that I read this year is the book Luster. This was actually a book that I didn't pick up on my own. I actually read this because I pulled it as like one of my Patreon prompts. It said to read a book that was like recommended by a celebrity or something like that. And so this book was highly recommended by Emma Roberts on her Instagram. And so I read it because of that. And I did not think I would love this the way that I did. Like, I actually gave this book 5 stars. I read it back in January this year, but I've still been thinking about it a lot ever since. And this story is really fascinating because we're following this woman who gets involved with a married couple because they have like an open marriage, and so she starts to get involved with them, and that actually is something that I really love reading about. I don't know why. It's like, it's just one of those things that I get so curious about people's like open relationships and like how people go about doing those things. I find it absolutely fascinating to read about open marriages and stuff. So that is the aspect of the book that really pulled me in and intrigued me. But also the writing in this book is what sold me, like hook, line, and sinker. The writing is absolutely gorgeous. Like, it is so lyrical and beautiful and just stunning. Like, I've been thinking about the writing in this book all year long, and that's definitely what made it such a surprising read for me. I think I'm gonna be reading anything this author writes because of how beautifully written in this book was. The next one is another book that I don't know if I ever would have picked this up on my own, but it's Almond. And this is actually a book that I read for the reading vlog that I did earlier this year where I read RM of BTS. I read his book recommendations. I don't mean to brag, but like my fave has got great taste because this book was incredible. I wasn't expecting it to be a 5-star read for me. Like I thought I would like it, but I didn't think it was gonna be like a new favorite for me. And in this book, the thing that I find absolutely fascinating is that we're following this young boy in this book, and it says that he's born with a brain condition that makes it hard for him to feel emotions like fear or anger. And so this book is really interesting because we follow this character as he witnesses something that is very shockingly violent and just very horrific, but his reaction to the violent thing that he's seeing isn't exactly what you would expect because he has this brain condition. And so he was just a very unique and interesting character to follow. I really connected with not only him as a character, but I loved the bond that he had with his mom and his grandma, and his family like owns this bookstore in this book, so there's a lot of really great, you know, atmosphere of like this bookstore. And also just the writing in this book was really incredible. Like there's a lot of quotes in this book. Like I absolutely like tabbed the hell out of this because there were so many quotes that really stuck with me. One of my favorite quotes was about love and the idea of love, because he says, "From what I understood, love was an extreme idea, a word that seemed to force something undefinable into the prison of letters. But the word was used so easily, so often. People spoke of love so casually, just to mean the slightest pleasure or thanks." And I just think that's so true and such a beautiful way to phrase that. Another book that absolutely surprised the hell out of me is gotta be Yerba Buena by Nina LaCour. And this book is one that was on my backlist. You know, like this has been sitting on my bookshelf since May 2022, and I've just been pushing it off for a long time because I was never sure if this was gonna be my thing. Because Nina LaCour, I have read some of her books before. I've only read her young adult stuff, and I don't know if she's written anything outside of young adult stuff besides this book. But this book is kind of like an adult, like literary fiction. I mean, there's definitely a lot of romance in this book, but I don't think I would consider this a romance because it's definitely written in a way that feels more like literary fiction or even contemporary to me. But the romance! Oh, the romance in this book! So in this story, we're following these two women named Emily and Sarah, and both of them just have a lot of different trauma and like family problems that go on in their lives. Like this book just kind of reads like a really sad movie drama where you're just following these two characters who have a lot of things going on in their lives, and most of it is like out of their control and like they're just trying to do everything they can. But something that I really do like about this book is that the author sets up the story so that we get a lot of time to be introduced to each character before they even meet each other, which I think is really cool, and that's probably what makes this book less of a romance and more of like a literary fiction kind of just character study, because both Emily and Sarah, like there's so much happening in their lives before we even get to the point where they meet in this book. I don't know, I see a lot of people say that this book is just like a book where nothing happens and there's no real plot, and that's why it feels kind of like literary fiction to me. But also, I didn't care. Like I was so invested in the story and in the characters, and there was just something about the writing, it just kept pulling me back in. And I read this all within like one sitting. Like I could not put this book down. I just really loved it. And even though this book is technically not a romance, I swear the romance that was happening in this book was like one of my favorite things that I've read this year. I was just rooting for them so hard. Another book that I was really surprised by was Katherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. And this is one that I have been meaning to get around to for years. Like this has been on my TBR ever since it came out in 2020. And I've just been pushing it off for a long time because while some of my friends do consider this to be like one of their favorite books, and that was always like a good sign to me. I was like, you know, maybe this will end up being my thing. I see a lot of people compare this to Bunny, which was always like a very good sign to me. But then at the same time, like when I read this book this year, I read it because it was the lowest rated Goodreads book on my shelf at the time, on my want to read shelf. And I was like, holy shit, like the ratings are that low. So I think I went into this with some pretty low expectations just because most of the people that have read this did not really end up enjoying it. And it's funny because I ended up really loving this book, but I actually do agree with a lot of the negative reviews for this, because in this book, like, let's be real, nothing really happens and nothing makes sense. But I actually didn't mind that about this book. I actually just really loved the writing in this. I thought the main character, she was interesting. Like, she wasn't my favorite main character that I've ever read because she's very flawed, but she also just feels very real because of that. I also feel like this is just one of those really like thought-provoking kind of weird books that just like gets under your skin. It's so atmospheric because all of it takes place at this school called Katherine House. And the thing that I think is so fascinating about this school is that this is like a very elite, like, you know, kind of school where you have to get selected to go here. Like not anybody can just go to Katherine House. And it's really cool because you have to give up like your life basically and dedicate 3 years of your life to Katherine House, and during those 3 years you are not allowed to have any connections to the outside world. And it's just fascinating. I don't know, like the idea of this place was really cool to read about. I think it's almost intentional that the book gets more confusing the further in that you get. Like I think there's an explanation for that, and I actually really love that about this book. This is just one of those books that makes for a really great discussion because you can talk about so many different weird things that were going on in this book, and you can all theorize and like make your different theories about what was actually going on. And I love that so much. Like I love that in books. So I really loved this one. I'm definitely going to keep my eye to see what this author publishes next because I think this is her debut book if I'm incorrect, and I don't think she's published anything since, so I have got my eyes on Miss Elizabeth Thomas. Right, and then the last book I read on this list of most surprising has got to be The Book of the Most Precious Substance by Sarah Gran, and this was one of my most surprising books of this year for sure because I have read the book Come Closer by Sarah Gran. I thought it was just okay. It was a horror novella that I didn't really feel too much for it, to be honest. I just thought it was fine. And so this book, I was like, I don't even know if this would be my thing or not because people say it's very weird. And this one, it just says it's about a mysterious book that promises unlimited power and unrivaled sexual pleasure, following this character named Lily, who is a book dealer, and she's trying to find this book for a client. And I thought that sounds kind of boring, no? Like you're just following a character who's like a book dealer and she's trying to track down this like mysterious well-known book that has like magical sex powers. It sounds like it would be so weird and like not even something I'd be interested in reading. But oh my gosh, there was just something about this book. It was so interesting to me. I could not put it down. The writing was so good. The characters were so intriguing. And even though I read this back in like February or March this year, I've been thinking about this one a lot this year. Like what even the fuck was that book? But like in a good way, you know, like it makes me almost want to reread it again just to remember all the like fine little details of things that I really liked about this one. This book just felt like such a trip, dude. It was so weird, but I just really loved that about it. Like it was so different from anything that I've ever read before. All right, those are all of the most surprising books that I read in the year of 2023. I'm so excited to kick off all of these end of the year videos. Very soon I'm gonna be posting my most disappointing books of the year, my best and my worst, and I can't wait. I love doing these videos so much every single year. You'll have to let me know if you've read any of the books on this list. Please let me know what are your thoughts on any of these books, and also let me know what were some of the most surprising books that you read this year. I would love to know if you went into some books with like really low expectations or you thought you wouldn't like them for whatever reason and then they ended up being amazing, like 5 stars, like you ended up loving some of them. I would love to know that, so please do let me know in the comments. And thank you so much for watching. As always, I will see you very soon with some more end of the year videos. So thanks for watching. Bye.